August 14th, 1943, Camp Hereford, Texas. The mess hall doors swung open at 0600 hours sharp, and 300 Italian prisoners of war filed in for breakfast. Steam rose from metal trays piled with scrambled eggs, bacon, white bread, and coffee so weak it looked like dishwater. The Americans had prepared what they considered a decent meal, generous even given wartime rationing. The Italians took one look and refused to eat. Not a single man touched his tray. They stood there in the suffocating August heat, arms crossed, faces set in expressions that somehow managed to convey both defiance and deep personal offense. The American guards shifted uncomfortably, hands moving toward their rifles. This wasn't hunger strike territory yet, but it was heading somewhere no one had anticipated. The camp commander, Colonel Morrison, was summoned immediately. What happened next would transform not just Camp Hereford, but change the way America thought about food, about prisoners, and about the thin line between punishment and dignity. Because the Italians weren't staging a political protest. They were fighting for something the Americans couldn't begin to understand. They were fighting for their souls. Morrison was a career military man, 52 years old, raised on beef and potatoes in Oklahoma. He arrived at the mess hall expecting insubordination, maybe even violence. What he found was stranger. The Italians weren't angry. They looked heartbroken. One of them, a sergeant from Naples named Antonio Viscardi, stepped forward as spokesman. His English was rough but clear enough. "Colonel, we cannot eat this. It is not food. It is an insult." Morrison stared at the untouched trays. "That's bacon. Real bacon. You know how hard it is to get bacon right now? There's a war on, in case you forgot." "We did not forget," Viscardi said quietly. "We were in it. But we are still men. We are still Italian. And we cannot eat like animals." The other prisoners murmured agreement. Morrison felt his jaw tighten. He dealt with German POWs who'd attempted escape, Japanese prisoners who'd maintained hostile silence for months. But Italians complaining about the quality of their free meals? This was new territory. He was about to order them back to their barracks when Viscardi spoke again. "Let us cook. Give us a kitchen, ingredients. We will make our own food. We will cause no trouble. But we must cook." The request hung in the air like something from another universe. Morrison looked at his second-in-command, Captain Reynolds, who shrugged with an expression that said he'd seen everything now. The idea was absurd. Prisoners demanding kitchen privileges, asking to be trusted with knives, with fire, with the intimate control that came from preparing your own meals. Every regulation screamed no. But Morrison was tired. The war in Europe was grinding toward its conclusion. These men weren't fanatical. They'd surrendered in North Africa after Rommel's collapse, most of them half-starved and relieved to be done fighting. They worked hard in the camp gardens, caused minimal trouble, and spent their evenings singing songs that made the guards' wives stop and listen from beyond the fence. They were the enemy, technically, but they didn't feel like the enemy. "I'll think about it," Morrison said. "Get back to your barracks." The Italians filed out, still hungry, but somehow standing taller. Morrison watched them go and felt something shift in his understanding of what this camp was supposed to be. Not just a holding pen, not just a punishment. Something more complicated than that. That night, Morrison couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Viscardi's face when he'd called the food an insult. Not to America. To civilization itself. Morrison had grown up during the Depression, eaten his share of thin soup and day-old bread. Food was fuel. You ate what you got and thanked God for it. But these Italians seemed to operate on different principles entirely. For them, food wasn't just sustenance. It was identity. Culture. Home. He made his decision by dawn. 3 days later, a work crew of Italian prisoners assembled in a storage building that had previously held tools and spare lumber. Morrison stood before them with Captain Reynolds and 2 guards. "You want to cook," Morrison said. "Here's your kitchen. You'll get flour, tomatoes from the garden, oil, salt, whatever we can spare from supplies. You feed yourselves. You clean up after. You cause problems, this ends immediately. Understood?" The Italian stood in stunned silence. Then Viscardi stepped forward and shook Morrison's hand with both of his own, gripping tight enough that Morrison felt the calluses from months of labor. "You will not regret this, Colonel. I promise you this." What Morrison didn't know was that among the 300 Italian prisoners, at least a dozen had been professional cooks back home. 2 had worked in restaurants in Rome. 1, a quiet man named Giuseppe Tucci, had been a pasta maker in Bologna before the war, learning the craft from his grandmother who'd learned it from hers. These men hadn't touched real pasta in over a year. The ache for it had become physical. Within a week, the storage building had transformed. The Italians scrounged and improvised with the focused intensity of men on a sacred mission. They built a brick oven from materials salvaged around the camp. They fashioned work tables from scrap wood. They turned old metal drums into makeshift stoves. Guards who checked on them found men working with a precision that seemed almost religious. Because it was. The first batch of pasta was made on August 23, 1943. 10 days after the initial breakfast rebellion, Tucci and 3 others worked through the night, mixing flour and water and eggs they'd traded cigarettes for. They kneaded the dough until their forearms burned, rolled it thin, cut it into long ribbons that they hung over broomsticks to dry. By morning they had enough fettuccine for all 300 men. The sauce was simple. Tomatoes from the camp garden, garlic they'd been growing in secret in coffee cans, olive oil Morrison had authorized from supplies, salt, and nothing else. No meat, no cream, no fancy techniques, just ingredients treated with the kind of respect that Americans reserved for church. When lunch was called that day, the Italians lined up with an eagerness the guards had never seen. The mess hall filled with steam that smelled nothing like the usual boiled vegetables and mystery meat. It smelled like something that had a past, a history, a homeland. The first man to receive his portion, a young private from Sicily, took one bite and started crying. Not quiet tears. Sobbing, his shoulders shook as he bent over his plate, fork gripping the pasta like it might disappear. Within minutes, half the prisoners were weeping openly. Guards stood at their posts, rifles ready, watching 300 enemy soldiers cry over noodles. Captain Reynolds whispered to Morrison, "Should we be concerned about this, sir?" Morrison watched a gray-haired prisoner eat with his eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been prayer. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think we should." The pasta wasn't just good. It was transcendent. It was memory made edible. Every bite carried them back across the ocean to Sunday dinners with family, to first dates in piazzas, to mothers and sisters and wives who knew that the way you prepared food was the way you said "I love you" without speaking. These men had lost everything. Their country had betrayed them by allying with Hitler, then abandoned them by switching sides. They were prisoners in a desert that might as well have been Mars, but in that moment, with pasta warming their bellies and the taste of garlic on their tongues, they were home. Word spread fast. Within days, guards were asking if they could try some. Morrison authorized it, curious what the fuss was about. When he took his first bite, he understood. This wasn't the spaghetti he'd had at Italian restaurants in San Antonio, drowning in sweet tomato sauce with meatballs the size of baseballs. This was something else entirely. Subtle, balanced. The pasta itself had flavor, texture, life. The sauce didn't mask it, didn't overwhelm it. Everything worked together with a harmony he'd never experienced in food before. "My God," Reynolds said, eating his portion slowly, reverently. "Is this what food is supposed to taste like?" The Italian kitchen became the heart of the camp. Every meal was an event. The cooks experimented within their limited supplies, creating variations that amazed even themselves. They made pasta e fagioli with beans and the last scraps of ham bone. They created carbonara using powdered eggs and any pork they could acquire. When Morrison authorized a small amount of pecorino cheese as a trial, grown men fought over who would grate it. But the transformation went deeper than food. The act of cooking, of controlling something in their lives, of creating rather than just enduring, changed the prisoners fundamentally. Men who'd been listless started volunteering for extra work details, hoping to earn privileges or find ingredients. The camp gardens exploded in productivity as Italians treated tomato plants like beloved children, checking them twice daily, talking to them in gentle voices that made guards laugh until they saw the results. Depression rates dropped. Fights became almost non-existent. The Italians sang while they worked, taught guards phrases in Italian, started carving wooden spoons and bowls in their spare time. They built an outdoor dining area with tables made from pallets, strung lights made from whatever they could find, created an atmosphere that looked less like a prison camp and more like a village piazza. American soldiers started requesting transfers to Camp Hereford, not because it was easy duty, because the food was incredible and the atmosphere was unlike anything else in the military. Morrison started getting calls from other camp commanders, asking what the hell he was doing out there in Texas that made his prisoners so cooperative and his guards so enthusiastic about their posts. He tried explaining about the kitchen, about the pasta, about what happens when you let men maintain their dignity through the smallest acts of creation. Most commanders thought he'd lost his mind. One, Colonel Patterson from Camp Huntsville, laughed openly. "You're telling me you gave enemy prisoners control of a kitchen and they didn't poison anyone or stage an uprising?" "Morrison, you're either the luckiest son of a bitch in Texas or the craziest." "Maybe both," Morrison admitted. "But my camp runs smoother than any in the state, and I sleep fine at night." By December 1943, the Italian kitchen was producing meals for guards as well as prisoners. American soldiers stationed at Hereford were eating better than almost any troops in the Southwest. They had pasta 3 times a week. They had bread made with techniques passed down through generations. They had vegetables prepared in ways that actually made them taste good instead of like boiled punishment. Wives of guards started showing up at the fence, asking the Italian cooks for advice. "How do you make sauce that tastes like this? What's the secret to bread that has this texture?" The Italians, starved for purpose, took on these questions with professorial seriousness. They held impromptu cooking classes through the chain link, demonstrating techniques, explaining principles, sharing knowledge that had been passed down in their families for centuries. A guard's wife named Martha Henderson learned to make gnocchi from Tucci himself. She spent 3 afternoons at the fence, watching him form the little potato dumplings with a fork, learning the exact pressure needed to create those ridges that would catch the sauce. When she finally got it right, making a batch at home that her husband declared the best thing he'd ever eaten, she baked cookies and brought them to the fence as thanks. Tucci wept when he tasted them, because they reminded him of cookies his daughter used to make. These small exchanges of humanity through food created bonds that nobody had authorized, but nobody could deny. The Italians weren't just prisoners anymore. They were teachers, artisans, keepers of knowledge that America was only beginning to understand it didn't have. In February 1944, Morrison received orders that made his stomach sink. The camp was being inspected by General Whitfield, a by-the-book commander known for shutting down any camp that wasn't operating according to strict military protocol. Morrison knew the kitchen was technically against regulations. Prisoners were supposed to be fed by camp staff, not allowed to cook their own meals. The general could shut the whole thing down with one memo. The inspection was scheduled for February 18th. Morrison called Viscardi to his office the week before. "We have a problem," he said, and explained the situation. Viscardi's face went pale. "You want us to stop cooking?" "I don't want you to do anything," Morrison said carefully. "But if the general sees what's happening here and doesn't approve, I won't have a choice. He could shut it down. Transfer you all to a standard camp. Send me to some desk job in Louisiana." Viscardi was quiet for a long moment. "What if we cook for the general?" Morrison blinked. "What?" "Let us prepare a meal. Show him what we have created here. Food is truth, Colonel. You cannot lie with pasta. Either it is good or it is not. Let the general taste what we do, and he will understand. It was insane. It was perfect." Morrison agreed. General Whitfield arrived on schedule, a stern man in his 60s, with ribbons covering half his chest, and an expression that suggested he'd never been impressed by anything in his life. He toured the camp with Morrison, making notes, asking pointed questions about security protocols and prisoner work details. Everything was technically in order, but Morrison could feel the tension building toward the inevitable moment when they'd reach the kitchen. Finally, they arrived at the converted storage building. Whitfield stopped in the doorway, taking in the brick oven, the work tables, the shelves of ingredients, the dozen Italians working with the coordinated efficiency of a surgical team. "What exactly is happening here, Colonel?" Morrison took a breath. "The prisoners requested permission to prepare their own meals, sir. I authorized it. It's improved morale significantly and actually reduced security incidents by 78%. Whitfield's jaw tightened. "You gave enemy prisoners access to knives and fire?" "Yes, sir, under strict supervision." "This is completely outside standard protocol." "Yes, sir, it is." Whitfield turned to look at Morrison directly. "You realize I could have you court-martialed for this?" "I do, sir." The general walked into the kitchen. The Italians froze, uncertain whether to continue working or stand at attention. Tucci, covered in flour up to his elbows, made the decision for everyone. He stepped forward and said in careful English, "General, we have prepared lunch. Would you honor us by eating?" Whitfield looked at the pasta maker, at Morrison, at the guards standing nervously by the door. Then he said, "Why the hell not?" They sat at one of the outdoor tables. Morrison, Whitfield, Captain Reynolds, and two of the general's aides. The Italians served a meal they'd been planning for days. Fresh pasta with a ragu that had been simmering since dawn. Bread still warm from the oven. A simple salad with vinegar and oil. Nothing fancy. Just food prepared with the kind of attention that most Americans had never experienced. Whitfield took one bite, then another. He chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. Morrison felt his career hanging in the balance with every second of silence. Finally, the general set down his fork. "Colonel Morrison," he said, his voice formal, "this is the best meal I've had in 20 years of military service." Morrison exhaled. Whitfield turned to Tucci, who was watching anxiously from the kitchen doorway. "You men know what you're doing. This isn't just cooking. This is art." Tucci bowed slightly. "It is survival, General. When you take away everything else, food is what remains. Food is memory. Food is home." The general nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression. He'd been a soldier for 3 decades, had eaten in mess halls across the globe, had accepted that military food was supposed to be functional, nothing more. But this meal had cracked something open in him, reminded him that humans needed more than just fuel. They needed beauty. They needed care. They needed to feel like more than numbers on a roster. "Keep the kitchen," Whitfield said to Morrison. "I'll authorize it in my report. But I want detailed security protocols written up, and I want monthly reports on how this program is working. If it keeps showing results like you claim, I'll recommend it for other camps." Morrison almost fell out of his chair. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir." The general finished his meal, accepted a second helping of pasta, and left Camp Hereford 3 hours later with a full stomach and a fundamentally altered view of what prisoner management could be. His official report praised the camp's innovative approach to maintaining prisoner morale and noted that the Italian kitchen had created the most cooperative prisoner population I have encountered in 15 years of inspection duty. Within 6 months, 5 other camps in Texas and New Mexico had requested permission to establish similar programs. The Italian prisoners, once derided as weak soldiers who'd surrendered too easily, became valued for their culinary knowledge. They taught American cooks techniques that would gradually seep into the broader culture. They showed guards and soldiers that food could be something worth caring about, worth investing time in, worth treating as more than just fuel. But Camp Hereford remained the original, the template, the place where it had all started over a refused breakfast and a desperate request to cook. By the time the war ended in 1945, the camp had produced thousands of meals that had fed not just bodies, but souls. It had shown that even in the middle of a war, even between enemies, humanity could survive if you gave it the smallest chance. When the Italians finally left Camp Hereford, repatriated to Italy in late 1945, there were tears on both sides of the fence. Guards who'd eaten pasta carbonara for the first time in their lives lined up to shake hands with prisoners they'd spent years guarding. Tucci presented Morrison with a wooden spoon he'd carved, the handle inscribed with words in Italian, "Per l'uomo che capiva," for the man who understood. Morrison kept that spoon on his desk for the rest of his military career, which lasted another 12 years. He never forgot what happened at Camp Hereford, never stopped believing that the small act of letting men cook their own food had taught him more about leadership than any manual ever could. The story might have ended there, fading into the footnotes of World War II history. But food has a way of outlasting everything else. The techniques the Italians taught, the passion they shared, the revelation they provided about what food could be, all of that rippled outward in ways no one tracked, but everyone eventually felt. Guards went home to their families and demanded better meals, not because they were ungrateful, but because they'd tasted what was possible. They taught their wives the techniques they'd learned through the fence. Those wives taught their friends. Soldiers who'd been stationed at Hereford spread out across America after the war, carrying memories of pasta that had made grown men cry, of bread that tasted like something sacred, of the way Italians treated food like it mattered. In the decades after the war, as Italian immigrants opened restaurants across America, they found an audience that hadn't existed before. Soldiers who'd eaten at Camp Hereford and camps like it knew what real Italian food tasted like. They became the first generation of Americans who understood that Italian cuisine was more than spaghetti and meatballs. They demanded authenticity. They sought out the real thing. Giuseppe Tucci returned to Bologna after the war and reopened his family's pasta shop. He never spoke much about his time as a prisoner, but he kept a photograph on his wall, the Italian kitchen at Camp Hereford, 20 men standing in front of their brick oven, covered in flour and smiling like they'd won something important, because they had. Antonio Viscardi settled in New York and opened a restaurant in 1952. It was small, just 12 tables, but it served food prepared exactly the way he'd learned to make it during the war. The way his mother had taught him, the way generations before her had passed it down. He hung a small American flag in the window, not as irony, but as gratitude. America had imprisoned him, yes, but it had also let him cook. And in that kitchen in the Texas desert, he'd learned that food could be a bridge between enemies, could create understanding where words failed. Colonel Morrison retired in 1957 and wrote a memoir that was never published. In it, he devoted 3 chapters to the Italian kitchen, trying to explain what had happened, why it mattered, how something as simple as letting prisoners cook had changed the entire culture of a camp. "I thought I was running a prison," he wrote. "But what I actually ran was a school." The Italians taught us that food is dignity, that cooking is creation, that even in the worst circumstances, humans need beauty, need flavor, need the chance to make something with their own hands that brings joy to others. I gave them a kitchen. They gave us a revolution we didn't know we needed. The story of Camp Hereford and its Italian kitchen eventually became a small legend in military history circles, referenced in books about prisoner management and cultural exchange, but mostly it lived on in the memories of those who'd been there, who'd tasted that first batch of pasta and understood that something had shifted in their world. Food wasn't just food anymore. It was culture, identity, home. And America, whether it knew it or not, had learned this lesson from prisoners in a Texas desert who'd refused to eat bad eggs and demanded the right to cook. That lesson rippled through the decades. It influenced how Americans thought about food, about cooking, about the care that could be invested in a meal. It was part of the foundation that would eventually make America fall in love with Italian cuisine, that would make fresh pasta a luxury item and authentic red sauce a point of pride. All of it traced back to that moment in August 1943, when 300 Italian prisoners stood in a mess hall and refused to eat. When a colonel made a decision that broke every rule. When men who'd been enemies remembered they were human first. The last surviving member of Camp Hereford's Italian kitchen, a man named Carlo Rossi, who'd been 19 years old in 1943, gave an interview in 2003 at the age of 79. He was asked what he remembered most about his time as a prisoner of war in Texas. He didn't talk about the guards or the work details, or the heat or the loneliness of being so far from home. He talked about the first time he'd tasted pasta again after more than a year without it. How it had broken something open inside him that he'd been keeping locked down just to survive. How he'd cried and not been ashamed. How the Americans watching had looked confused at first, then gradually understood that they were witnessing something bigger than hunger being satisfied. "Food is not just eating," he said in accented English, his hands moving the way Italians' hands always move when they talk about things that matter. "Food is memory. Food is love. Food is who you are when everything else is taken away." Those Americans, they didn't understand this at first. They thought food was just fuel for the body. But we taught them. With flour and tomatoes and thyme, we taught them that food is how you stay human. How you remember who you were before the war and who you will be after. He paused, looking at something the interviewer couldn't see, some memory from 60 years before. "Colonel Morrison, he gave us back our humanity when he gave us that kitchen. We gave him pasta. It was a fair trade." The interviewer asked if he'd ever returned to Texas, to Camp Hereford. Rossi smiled. "Once, in 1989. The camp was gone. All of it demolished. Nothing left but empty land and wind. But I stood where the kitchen had been, and I swear to you, I could still smell the garlic, the tomatoes, the bread baking. Memory lives in the nose, you know. You can forget faces, forget names, but you never forget the smell of food that saved your soul." Camp Hereford exists now only in documents and memories. The buildings were torn down in the 1960s, the land returned to Texas scrubland, but its legacy persists in ways both traceable and invisible. in the restaurants that dot America's landscape, in the home cooks who understand that pasta deserves respect, in the revelation that even enemies can teach you something essential about being human. The Pasta Rebellion of 1943 wasn't about food. Not really. It was about dignity, about the human need to create, to control something, to maintain identity when everything else is stripped away. The Italians weren't fighting for better meals. They were fighting for their souls. And in a miracle of wartime grace, they found an American colonel who understood that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply letting people cook. That first batch of fettuccine, made by hands that knew the weight of tradition and the ache of exile, didn't just feed 300 prisoners. It planted seeds that would grow into a changed relationship between America and food, between captors and prisoners, between cultures that thought they had nothing to learn from each other. Food, it turns out, is the most powerful language we have. It transcends borders, survives wars, carries memory across oceans and decades. And in a prison camp in Texas in 1943, that language spoke so clearly that even enemies could understand each other. The kitchen is gone. The men are mostly gone. But the lesson remains, as fresh as that first bite of pasta that made soldiers cry. When you honor someone's food, you honor their humanity. When you let them cook, you let them live. And sometimes, in the middle of a war, the most important battle is the one fought with flour and water, and the stubborn insistence that dignity matters more than regulations. That's what the Italian prisoners of Camp Hereford taught America. One meal at a time, with patience and passion, and the kind of love that can only be expressed through food prepared with care. They were prisoners, yes, but in that kitchen, surrounded by the smells of home, they were free. And they made everyone around them a little freer too.